What happens when the mayor interrupts the assemblyman 6 times in one night? The seventh line leaves the mayor completely speechless and the audience on its feet. The lights inside CUNY's Graduate Center auditorium were hot and bright, bouncing off the stage floor and catching the glint of local news cameras lined up at the back. This wasn't just another panel, it was billed as a town hall on the future of New York City, but everyone in the building knew what they had really come to see. Zohran Mamdani and Eric Adams, side by side, live. From the moment the two men walked onto the stage, the air changed. Mamdani moved with the focused intensity of a community organizer, his stride purposeful, his face composed. He gave a direct, earnest nod to the audience. Adams's entrance was different. It was the confident swagger of a man who runs the 5 boroughs, shoulders back, a slight smirk on his lips as if he owned the very stage he was walking onto. The crowd erupted with a mix of sharp cheers and deep groans, the sound echoing in the hall. People had come from all over the city to be there. In the second row sat a tenant organizer from the Bronx, her eyes locked on the stage. An NYU student balanced his phone in one hand, already streaming live to his friends. The press pool from NY1 and the Daily News scribbled furiously. It was only the first minute, but the sense of anticipation was already unbearable. The moderators, 2 veteran city journalists, sat between the men. One leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady. "We're here to talk about the direction of New York City, how we can tackle the affordability crisis, ensure public safety, and make sure every voice is heard." Adams adjusted his tie, looking out at the crowd with a familiar confidence. Mamdani, on the other hand, shifted in his chair, his expression focused, ready. The difference in energy was striking. One man holding court, the other itching to challenge him. When Mamdani finally leaned toward the mic, the room stilled. "Look," he began, his tone direct, as if speaking not to the cameras but to every person in the room struggling to pay their rent. "This conversation is bigger than any one of us sitting here. This city isn't just something we inherit, it's something we build, block by block, every single day." His words hung in the air, calm but firm. For a split second, there was silence. Then, just as Mamdani was setting up his next sentence, Adams leaned forward and cut across him. "All right, Zohran, we've heard all the poetry before," Adams said, waving a hand dismissively. "My job is to actually run the city. People need safe streets and a paycheck, not slogans." A ripple of reaction swept through the audience. The moderators exchanged a quick look, as if to say, "Here we go." But this was only the beginning. The second interruption came faster than anyone expected. Mamdani had returned to his thought, threading together a point about the importance of community-led solutions. His voice carried a calm authority. "The leadership," he said, eyes moving across the hall, "isn't just about speaking the loudest. It's about listening, about respecting the people you serve." Adams lunged forward, his chair creaking. "Respect? Are you kidding me?" boomed. "Where was the respect for public safety when you were pushing to defund our police? Where's the respect for the taxpayers who have to foot the bill for your socialist fantasies? You talk about respect. You don't even know the meaning of the word." Gasps scattered across the audience. The moderators raised their hands. "Gentlemen, please." But Adams wasn't listening. "I was a cop for 22 years. I protected this city while you were reading books. I create safety. You? More division, more crime, more speeches. Always speeches." For the first time, Mamdani turned directly toward him, not with anger, but with a steady gaze that made people in the back rows sit straighter. His hands stayed flat on the table. "Mr. Mayor," he said evenly, "if you are going to interrupt, at least let me finish the sentence first." The crowd reacted instantly. Applause burst out, followed by laughter. Adams's face flushed slightly under the lights. Attending the lights, but he smirked. The moderator seized the moment. "Let's allow Assemblyman Mamdani to finish his thought." Mamdani leaned forward again. "This isn't about scoring points. It's about whether we can actually face the problems this city is dealing with. Problems that don't care about who gets the last word." As soon as Mamdani transitioned to housing, drawing on his record of fighting for tenants, Adams leaned in again. Don't even start on housing. You destroyed it. Your policies kill new construction. They drive landlords out of business, and everybody knows it. The crowd split right down the middle, half groaning, half clapping. Obama didn't raise his voice. Instead, he angled his body slightly toward Adams, his tone calm. Mr. Mayor, if my ideas for tenants were so unpopular, the real estate lobbyists wouldn't be spending millions of dollars every year to fight them. Another ripple of laughter and sustained applause swept through the audience. Adams sat back, shaking his head. The moderators exhaled. All right, one said firmly. We're going to give each participant uninterrupted time. But everyone knew that promise wouldn't hold. The third interruption came moments later. Mamdani had begun outlining a point about the balance between public safety and community investment. His voice was steady. True safety doesn't just come from more policing. It comes from fully funded schools, mental health services, and good jobs. Suddenly, Adams lurched forward, pointing a finger. Community investment? You nearly destroyed public safety with your anti-police rhetoric. You sided with activists over the cops. You're the last person who should lecture anybody on keeping New Yorkers safe. The room broke into chaos. Shouts from the crowd, applause from Adams' supporters, groans from others. The moderators were drowned out completely. It was no longer a town hall in the traditional sense. It had become a stage where Eric Adams was trying to grab all the light, no matter how. Zohran Mamdani didn't flinch. He let the noise ride out for a few seconds, then leaned forward with his hands folded, his gaze firmly on the moderators rather than on the mayor. If I may finish, he began. Adams cut in again. Finish what? Another excuse? Another story about how you know best? This city was tired of your rhetoric, Zohran. That's why they chose a cop to be their mayor. That last phrase, chose a cop to be their mayor, hung heavy in the air. The crowd erupted once more, some on their feet clapping, others jeering. Security guards along the walls shifted in place. Even the moderators looked rattled. But Mamdani's response wasn't anger. It was calm precision. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the mayor's words. Mr. Mayor, winning an election is one thing. Governing for everyone in this city, not just the ones who voted for you, is another. And they are not the same. The audience roared. The applause this time was louder, sharper, carrying with it a tone of relief. People were waiting for Mamdani to draw a clear line, and here it was. Adams scowled, but he wasn't finished. Spare me the lecture. You gave us years of failed progressive policies. Years of siding with activists over everyday New Yorkers. Nobody felt safe. You made this city weak. Mamdani remained composed. He waited, letting the rant finish and the audience react. Only then did he speak, his voice calm, almost quiet compared to the mayor's volume, but that calmness gave it weight. I'll tell you what weakens this city, Mamdani said. It's when we treat our neighbors in the outer boroughs like enemies. It's when leaders think shouting is the same as solving problems. That doesn't make us strong. It makes us small. The applause that followed was thunderous. Even the moderator sat back for a moment, eyes wide, realizing they had just witnessed the night's first real turning point. Adams, visibly irritated, muttered something into the microphone. But this time it didn't carry the same punch. For a brief moment, his momentum slipped. We need to move on to our next subject, one moderator said, her voice sharp and clear. The question on the table was about unity in a deeply divided city. Unity doesn't mean everyone agrees on everything, Mamdani began, his tone measured. It means recognizing that even when we disagree, we share the same subways, the same future. It means treating our opponents as fellow New Yorkers, not enemies. If we lose that, we lose the glue that holds this city together. The audience responded with soft applause, but the moment didn't last. Adams shot forward, his voice cutting across like a blade. Respect? You talk about respect while your allies and your political organizations attack me and my family every single day? Tried to destroy my administration with lies and protests? Don't talk to me about respect. New Yorkers remember what you did. A wave of noise rolled through the hall. Mamdani didn't respond immediately. He leaned back, one hand pressed to his chin, eyes fixed on Adams. The silence stretched. Finally, Mamdani leaned toward the mic, his tone light but cutting. Mr. Mayor, if you really think the entire progressive movement in this city has the time and the interest to spend all its resources just on you, that might say more about your ego than it does about our policies. The crowd exploded. Applause, laughter, cheers, it all blended together. Adams's face tightened, his jaw working. Total disgrace, he muttered into the mic. Mamdani waited for the noise to settle. The real danger isn't whether one man feels targeted, he said to the audience. The real danger is if we let politics convince us that the other side is always the enemy. Because if that happens, we don't just divide the city council. We divide neighborhoods. We divide families. And that's not who we are. Adams pushed forward again, louder now. Don't lecture me about division. You divided this city more than anyone. You weakened the NYPD. You encouraged chaos. You left us worse off than ever. That's why people turned to me. The moderators tried to cut in, but Mamdani simply lifted his hand slightly, as if signaling he could handle it. His face stayed calm. Mr. Mayor, shouting about chaos doesn't make you the solution. Sometimes it just makes you part of the problem. The response was immediate cheers and applause. For the first time, the moderators allowed themselves a breath, yet everyone sensed this wasn't the end. The fifth interruption came when the question turned to the city's budget. Mamdani had just started describing how a budget should reflect a city's values. A city's strength is best measured by the health of its people. When we invest in our libraries and schools and public hospitals, we are building a stronger foundation. That's when Adams sprang forward. Investment? You gave everything away. You bowed to the special interests, the activists, the socialists. I had to make the tough choices. I made this city fiscally responsible. You didn't. Mamdani didn't move. He glanced at Adams, then back at the moderators. His voice was low, but every word was clear. Mr. Mayor, a budget isn't about walking into a room and cutting services in to please Wall Street. It's about building trust with our communities, so that when times get tough, they know their city is fighting for them and not against them. That's what keeps New York strong. The audience erupted, not with laughter, but with heavy, grounded applause. But before Mamdani could continue, Adams cut in again, harder this time. He slapped his hand against the desk for emphasis, the sound popping through the microphones. Strong? You left the city's finances in chaos. Look at the deficit you wanted. Look at the programs with no accountability. You made this city weaker, and everybody knows it. The crowd's roar was louder this time. Cheers and boos blended so violently that for a moment the words from the stage were drowned out. The moderators raised their voices, one of them nearly shouting, "Mr. Mayor, please let the assemblyman finish his response." Adams didn't back down. He leaned closer, eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the microphone stand. Weak, that's what your ideas are. Weak on crime, weak on the economy, weak everywhere. That word, repeated, hammered in, rang through the hall. Weak. The word itself became the weapon. And that's when Zohran Mamdani leaned back, shoulders loose, almost as if he were settling into the chaos instead of fighting it. He let the audience noise rise and fall before speaking, his voice soft but commanding. If strength is measured by how loud you shout, he said, then maybe you've been confusing noise with leadership. But real strength is measured by whether you leave this city better than you found it. The crowd roared again, but this time there was something sharper in the response. A wave of applause that didn't fade quickly rolled across the room in a steady rhythm. People stood, some whistled, clapping with a kind of deliberate persistence that seemed to push Adams back into his chair. He forced a smile, but his jaw was tense. The moderators exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath for several minutes. "Please continue, Assemblyman," one said. Mamdani nodded politely, though his eyes lingered on Adams for a second longer than before. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. The tension in the room was now palpable. People weren't just watching a debate, they were watching two different styles of power collide. At diners in Brooklyn, in bars in the Bronx, in living rooms in Queens, families leaned closer to their televisions. This wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about presence. Though Adams still had the energy, the interruptions were starting to wear thin. Even some in the audience who supported him shifted in their seats. Mamdani, meanwhile, looked unshaken. If anything, each interruption made his eventual responses land harder. He wasn't just speaking, he was waiting, timing his lines so that the interruptions themselves became part of his rhythm. The sixth interruption finally died down, and the hall was buzzing with nervous tension. Cameras tightened, capturing every flicker of expression. Mamdani didn't rush. He sat back in his chair, his posture loose, one hand resting lightly on the table. The silence was uncomfortable, at least for Adams, who fidgeted, tapping his fingers, looking around as though silence itself were an opponent. For the audience, though, the silence was magnetic. The pause stretched just long enough for the tension to thicken. And then Mamdani leaned forward, his voice calm, almost quiet. "You know," he said, glancing briefly at Adams, "interruptions don't make your arguments stronger. They just make them louder." The words were simple, but they landed with precision. The audience responded instantly. Adams forced a smirk, but his eyes betrayed irritation. Mamdani let the response ride for a moment, then continued, his cadence deliberate. "As an organizer, I learned something important. If you spend all your energy cutting people off, you don't have any left to actually listen. And if you don't listen, you don't learn. And if you don't learn, you can't lead." The crowd broke again into sustained, meaningful applause. They clapped because they recognized a contrast laid bare on the stage. Adams leaned into his microphone, his voice sharp. "That's your problem. Too much listening, not enough action. I act. I get things done." But something had shifted. The crowd didn't respond with the same roar. There were scattered claps, but also audible groans from people tired of the cycle. Mamdani waited again, letting the air settle. When he spoke, his words were measured, cutting with quiet force. "Mr. Mayor, the difference between action and chaos is whether you're building something or just tearing things down. Anyone can shout, anyone can break things. But leadership, real leadership, is about building, about leaving something behind that lasts longer than you do." The audience erupted. This time it was a standing ovation. Adams shook his head, muttering, his frustration tightening around his eyes. For the first time, it wasn't Mamdani who looked tested. It was the mayor. And then, as the moderator began the next question, something about the responsibilities of leadership, the seventh interruption came right on cue. Before Mamdani could complete a single thought, Adams jumped in, his voice sharper than ever. "Responsibilities? You were a disaster for this city's responsibilities. You left it more divided, weaker, and more dangerous. Don't sit there and act like you know anything about unity. Nobody believes you, nobody." The audience roared, split right down the middle, half clapping, half booing so loudly the moderators had to raise their voices. "Please, both of you, let's have order," one of them pleaded, slamming her palm gently on the table. And then came the moment. Mamdani didn't look rattled. He waited. He let the noise rise, then fall, until there was just enough quiet for his words to cut through. He leaned in slightly, his voice calm, steady, almost conversational. "Mr. Mayor," he said, pausing for effect, "if you have to interrupt me 6 times every time I talk about funding our communities, it says less about my ideas and a whole lot more about how afraid you are to explain why you won't." The hall erupted, not in confusion, not in split reactions. This was different. The applause was immediate, overwhelming, drowning out every other sound. People rose to their feet, some shouting, "Yes!" others whistling. It wasn't just support, it was catharsis, a release of all the tension that had been building since the first interruption. Adams blinked, caught completely off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a ready line. No quick retort, no loud dismissal. His silence was louder than any of his earlier interruptions. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a ready line. No quick retort, no loud dismissal to throw back across the table. His silence was louder than any of his earlier interruptions. Zohran Mamdani didn't press. He didn't gloat. He simply sat back, letting the crowd respond, his hands folded on the table. The moderators exchanged looks that said everything. They knew this was the moment people would remember. The audience reaction didn't fade quickly. It kept building, rolling through the hall like thunder from an approaching subway train. People in the balconies stamped their feet. In the front rows, older attendees clapped so hard their palms turned red. Even some who had applauded the mayor earlier now sat back, their faces betraying a kind of grudging respect. At home, televisions flickered with the moment replayed in real time. In apartments in the East Village, in diners in Sunset Park, in dorms at Columbia, people leaned closer to their screens. Clips were already being cut and shared on Instagram. The sentence, short, sharp, undeniable, was on its way to becoming the night's headline. Adams shifted uncomfortably, leaning back in his chair. His lips tightened. He tapped the desk with his fingers, searching for footing, but there was none. For once, silence swallowed him whole. Mamdani, still calm, leaned forward again, this time addressing the audience directly. This city doesn't need leaders who shout. It needs leaders who listen. Leaders who understand that if you're afraid of the people's questions, you try to drown them out. But if you're confident in your vision, you don't need to interrupt. You just let your ideas stand. The ovation grew even louder, forcing the moderators to pause again. Adams attempted to speak, but the sound of the audience drowned him out. He gestured with his hands, shook his head, muttered into the mic, but it was useless. The room had turned. The momentum was firmly out of his grasp. The eruption in the CUNY auditorium was unlike anything the moderators had prepared for. The standing ovation kept rolling, refusing to die down. Camera crews scrambled. The energy was contagious, spilling from one section to the next. "Let's keep the discussion moving, please," one moderator said, her voice nearly drowned out. Adams sat rigid in his chair, his jaw stiff. He adjusted his tie, then his cufflinks, but the cameras caught the flicker in his eyes. The irritation, the disbelief that the room had shifted so abruptly. Mamdani, meanwhile, remained composed. It wasn't triumph on his face, it was composure. He looked like a man who knew the power of silence after a strike. The audience eventually began to quiet. A woman in the second row leaned toward her husband, whispering, "That's the Zohran who took on the landlords. He doesn't back down." Even some of Adams's supporters were unsettled. A man wearing an IBEW union jacket crossed his arms. "He shouldn't have let him get that one in," he muttered. The moderators pressed forward. "Gentlemen, thank you. Let's move to the next topic, the city's economic priorities." But equal time had become an illusion. Every eye was fixed on Mamdani. He leaned into the microphone not to jab, but to answer. Economic priorities aren't just about policies, they're about people. About whether families in Sunset Park, or the South Bronx, or Jamaica, Queens, feel like City Hall is working for them. And that means more than press conferences or interruptions. It means results. The audience broke into applause again, softer this time, like an echo. Adams leaned forward sharply, trying to insert himself back into the flow. "Results? You didn't deliver results. Years of talk, crime through the roof, businesses leaving. You left this city worse." But his words didn't carry the same force. The crowd's response was mixed at best. The earlier roar that had fueled him was gone. It was as if the seventh line had drained the air out of his strategy. Mamdani glanced at Adams, then at the audience, and simply said, "If talking about the lives of New Yorkers is just talk, then maybe that's the problem." The crowd erupted again. The man who held them wasn't the one who shouted loudest, but the one who had silenced the shouting altogether. By midnight, the clip was everywhere. NY1 labeled it the moment that defined the night. On Twitter, hashtags like #NYCDebate and #Zohran's line trended across the city. TikTok was flooded with edits, looping the same moment of Mamdani leaning forward, calm and unshaken, as the mayor finally fell silent. On Instagram, captions read, "This is how you deal with a bully." The next morning, screens in bodegas showed the replay. Commuters on the L train passed phones around. At a pub in Astoria, a group of locals gathered around the TV. One man shook his head and laughed. He got him. Never seen the mayor shut down like that. A woman beside him leaned forward. That wasn't just a line. That was control. The viral moment crossed into everyday life. A mother in Flatbush told her teenage son, "See, that's what I mean when I say leadership is about patience, not just being loud." Adams's camp scrambled to spin it. His advisors went on inside City Hall, insisting he had simply chosen not to respond, that he wasn't going to get into the mud with a socialist. But the video itself told another story. The silence was undeniable. The clip lived on, not just as a viral highlight, but as a cultural marker for the city. People texted it to friends with the caption, "This is what leadership looks like." It became more than a debate. It became a moment of clarity in a political era defined by noise. It became a moment of clarity in a political era defined by noise. By the end of the week, the clip had been viewed tens of millions of times across platforms. Analysts on NY1 and in the New York Times compared it to other turning points in the city's political history, moments when one sentence shifted perception. And while the future of city politics remained uncertain, one thing was clear. People were hungry for composure in a time of chaos. But the story didn't end with virality. The real power of that moment came in the lesson it carried, a lesson about what leadership truly means. In the days that followed, analysts argued over poll bumps and sound bites. But for ordinary New Yorkers, the moment wasn't about statistics, it was about the feeling it left behind. That seventh line, delivered calmly after 6 interruptions, had revealed something bigger than just a debate stage. It showed the difference between noise and substance, between performance and presence. In Staten Island, a retired FDNY firefighter named Sal explained it to his granddaughter as they sat on the porch. "See, kid, leadership isn't about who yells the loudest. It's about who can sit in the storm and not let the storm run them." Mamdani didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. That's real strength. At a community gathering in a mosque in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, the imam brought it up. "When someone interrupts you again and again," he said, "remember that patience has its own power. Sometimes you let the other person burn themselves out, and then you speak your truth." Across the city, teachers wove the moment into lessons on communication. A debate coach at Bronx Science told her students, "Notice how Mamdani used silence as much as words. Notice how the mayor lost the room the moment he couldn't stop himself. That's a masterclass in control." Even in workplaces, people began referencing the clip. In a boardroom at a tech startup in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a manager told her team, "We don't have to be the loudest voice in the room, we just have to be the clearest." For millions of viewers, the moral was personal. It wasn't just about Mamdani and Adams anymore. It was about how they handled conflict in their own lives. Some thought about family arguments that had spiraled. Others remembered heated exchanges on the subway, moments where they wished they'd stayed calm instead of snapping back. Mamdani's pause, his silence before speaking, became a kind of model. Slow down, breathe, and then speak with clarity. The contrast between the two men had been stark all night. Adams pushing, interrupting, raising his volume. Mamdani waiting, listening, and then striking with precision. But that contrast revealed something deeper. Composure is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. In fact, those traits, when paired with conviction, can be stronger than the loudest voice in the room. Political experts called it a turning point. Social media called it a mic drop. But for many people, it was simply a reminder that in life, you don't win arguments by talking over someone. You win them by making sure what you say actually matters. Shouting may grab attention, but silence followed by clarity earns respect. The moderators, reflecting after the town hall, admitted they had nearly lost control of the night. But one of them said privately to a colleague, "Mamdani saved it. He showed everyone that you don't need volume to win. You just need composure." In the end, that was the lesson carried into living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces across the 5 boroughs. A lesson that outlasted the noise of the event itself. So if you're reading this, think about what that means in your own life. The next time someone interrupts you, the next time you feel the urge to shout back, remember what happened that night in New York. Remember the pause. Remember the 7th line. Because leadership, real leadership, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to speak when the time is right. And if you believe moments like this matter, if you believe patience, respect, and composure are values worth amplifying, then make sure you subscribe. because these are the stories we'll keep sharing. Stories that remind us what real strength looks like.